Hello, Zero Books readers. It's me again, Douglas Lane. Today, rather than discussing a book we've already published, I'll be announcing a new line of books that we hope to publish. This video won't try to illustrate a new radical idea or philosophical concept, but will instead aim to encourage you to help us develop an old concept. Instead of starting with a clip or with some vaporwave, I want to start with this very broad question. What would it mean if we could realize philosophy? When I released a video last year announcing this new line of 101 philosophy books, I received a number of responses. People were interested in writing for us, eager to participate in developing this new line of books. And at that time I mentioned Andrew Feenberg's book, The Philosophy of Praxis, and tried to sketch out the overall aim of this new line. These books should serve both as introductory guides to various philosophers, specifically the philosophers that are most often taught to undergraduates, and should serve to demonstrate how these philosophers are still relevant to the struggle for socialism today. Now, for this video I want to put forward a more specific call for submissions. Rather than just outline the general concept of the idea of realizing philosophy, I want to suggest a particular philosopher whose ideas we might try to realize. That philosopher is Plato. Before I start talking about Plato, I want to relate an anecdote about an old friend of mine who I knew in high school. We'd been friends since grade school, actually, but in high school, we were part of a group of kids who were sort of adjacent to the drama department, and we fancied ourselves as future filmmakers. One of the gang had a decent enough video camera, and he'd set up a couple of VCRs and a TV set in his bedroom to serve as an editing bay. The group of us would produce shorts and sketches with titles like Psycho Mr. Rogers and The Doug Lane Show. In any case, this friend I'm thinking about was the most serious person in our group. He bought an 8mm film camera, and he made us watch Stan Brakhage and Andy Warhol. He went on to become a college professor and teach film and literature. I bring this up because I remember a phone call from this friend, let's call him Jimmy, back in the late 90s. During this call, he related how he thought he might have messed up while teaching a course on film theory. He was hesitant to mention it, but he finally asked, "In philosophy, is there an approach to knowledge that isn't strictly empirical?" One of my students told me that we can get an understanding of the world that doesn't involve our senses, and I basically shut him down. I insisted that the only way to understand anything was through observation, or empirically. Jimmy was the smart one in our group, the one who was always bewildered by the silly rot the rest of us would go on about. But in this one case, he'd gotten something wrong, and I was the one who knew something. Reveling in the moment, I proceeded to explain Plato to him, and I figured that Plato's concept of forms was exactly the opposite of what empiricists like Hume and Berkeley would espouse later. Bishop George Berkeley argued that all of our understanding was derived through the senses, and that while we might believe that we had recourse to abstract ideas about such things as motion or matter, in fact, we only had experiences of particular things in motion, particular objects with particular qualities. For Berkeley, there's no such thing as what it is to be, say, an apple, only a variety of experiences that we call apples. We create the category of apple in the abstract only after finding similarities between these various particular apples. Plato, on the other hand, argued precisely the opposite. According to Plato, we are only able to recognize this apple, or that apple, as similar objects because we already have a notion of what it is to be an apple. For Plato, our understanding of the world isn't brought about through the senses, but rather we begin to remember the truth of these abstract forms. We remember what it is to be an apple as we go along through the world. We properly remember the truth of these forms only to the extent that we use our reason.
Envision human figures living in an underground cave with a long entrance across the whole width of the cave. Here they have been from their childhood and have their legs and necks chained so that they cannot move and can only see before them, being prevented by the chains from turning their heads around. above and behind them, a fire is blazing at a distance. They see only their own shadows, which the fire throws on the opposite wall of the cave. And now look again and see what will naturally follow if one of the prisoners is released. At first, when he is liberated and compelled suddenly to stand up and turn his head round and look towards the light, all this would hurt him, and he would be much too dazzled to see distinctly those things whose shadows he had seen before.
Another way to understand the difference between empirical knowledge and Plato's rationalism would be to consider the difference between inductive and deductive logic. Deductive reasoning discovers the truth by ferreting out the consequences of our initial premises and testing whether our conclusions truly do follow from them, while inductive reasoning takes the empirical observations that we make and tries to come to general principles from those. It's more on the side of Berkeley. An example of deductive reasoning occurs in Plato's dialogue with Euthyphro, wherein Socrates asks a titular character to explain what it is to be pious. Euthyphro suggests that what is pious is what is pleasing to the gods, and Socrates wonders whether this definition might lead in the wrong direction. Socrates reminds Euthyphro that the Greek gods often quarrel, and suggests that this quarreling means that they don't always agree about what is honorable and dishonorable, or about what is just and what is unjust. So to say that what is pious is that which pleases the gods isn't adequate because, quote, it would seem that what is loved by the gods is also hated by them, end quote. What Socrates is really after is some understanding of what it is to be pious, and not what it is for the gods to be pleased. After all, even if we amend the definition of piety to exclude those things on which the gods disagree, we still have to admit that what the gods all love together is not made lovable by the gods' choice to love it, but rather that they love it because it is a lovable thing in itself. When Socrates discovered that the oracle at Delphi held him up as the wisest man in Athens, he set off to prove the oracle wrong. He set off to inquire, to question, to debate with those who took themselves to be wise, in order to discover those who had the knowledge that he himself knew that he lacked. However, in order to test these men, he had to posit that there was such a thing as wisdom, and even that this wisdom was accessible to him deductively, or through a dialectical method of testing ideas. What Plato would have us believe is that Socrates posited something called the forms, and in Plato's dialogue, entitled Parmenides, he both had Socrates describe this theory of forms, and he subjects this idea of the forms to a brutal critique. In this dialogue, Socrates confronted the philosopher Zeno and his master Parmenides. He argued that their notion that the universe, despite appearing to contain a plurality of beings, was in fact only one. He argued against the idea that despite appearing to change, the world instead remained unchanged, that instead of appearing to be a multiplicity, the world was one thing, and he did this by expounding his theory of the forms. Socrates thought that Zeno and Parmenides had failed to differentiate between the world of empirical appearance and the world of notions, or the reality of his forms. He told Zeno, quote, "If a person shows that such things as wood, stones, and the like, being many, are also one, we admit that he shows the coexistence of the one and the many, but he does not show that the many are one or the one many. He is uttering not a paradox, but a truism. If, however, as I just now suggested, someone were to abstract simple notions of like, unlike, one, many, rest, motion, and similar ideas, and then to show that these admit of admixture and separation in themselves, I should be very much astonished." And this is what Parmenides, being the older and more practiced philosopher than Zeno, proceeded to do in the rest of the dialogue. In an essay entitled Dialectical Logic in Plato's Parmenides, Hegel's Logic, and Marx's Critique of Political Economy, published in the Links International Journal of Socialist Renewal, a writer named Jason Devine argued that Parmenides was a significant dialogue for would-be Marxists to study. He wrote that Hegel's pronouncement that Plato's Parmenides was, quote, perhaps the greatest literary product of ancient dialectic, end quote, could be justified by examining the most difficult section of the dialogue. That is, not the section wherein Parmenides demonstrates that Plato's notion of the forms contradicts itself, but rather the section where Parmenides takes up his own notion of the one and demonstrates the contradictions that can be found even in this most simple concept of all, which is the idea of the one or the singular. For instance, Parmenides argues that for something to be purely one, it cannot be more than one, or cannot contain separate parts. It cannot, for instance, include a beginning part, or a middle part, or an end. He goes on, however, to contradict this notion by suggesting that if the one is, it must partake in being, and if it partakes in being, then there must be two and not one. Parmenides says, if the one is, then the one will have being, but its being will not be the same with the one. For if the same, it would not be the being of the one, nor would the one have participated in being. For the proposition that one is would have been identical with the proposition that one is one. But our hypothesis is not if one is one, what will follow, but if one is. At this point, a non-philosopher might be tempted to cross his eyes or to smash his computer or smartphone into the mini. If this non-philosopher was a science fiction fan, he might be reminded of a quote from Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Or to put this another way, this argument reminds me of the original BBC series. Here's a clip.
The argument runs something like this. I refuse to prove that I exist, says God, for proof denies faith, and without faith I am nothing. But, says man, the Babelfish is a dead giveaway, isn't it? It proves you exist, and so therefore you don't. QED. Oh dear, says God, I hadn't thought of that, and promptly vanishes in a puff of logic. Oh, that was easy, says man, and for an encore he goes on to prove that black is white, and gets killed on the next zebra crossing.
Let's return to this idea of realizing philosophy. Jason Devine argues that the Parmenides dialogue is not absurd, but rather that his arguments demonstrate that even the concept of the one cannot be simply defined, but must be understood as an unfolding of related, but sometimes opposing ideas. Even more, Devine draws a line from Plato's Parmenides to Hegel's logic to Marx's analysis of the commodity. For him, each of these moments in philosophy represent stages in the development of the dialectic of reason. In an interview for the journal Historical Materialism, Andrew Feenberg said that philosophy of praxis aims to be more than a social or political philosophy. It treats proletarian revolution as a sort of philosophical method, capable of resolving the fundamental antimonies that characterize the whole Western philosophical tradition since its origins, end quote. And this idea is what this video is trying to pick up and work with and through. One way to resolve or realize philosophy, then, would be to take up Plato and his worst critic, Parmenides, to see how it is that Plato's conception of forms influences Parmenides' concept of the one, at least in that dialogue, and to see how it might be that a Platonic form can continue to be apprehended even after Parmenides has had his way with it. To put this in concrete terms, we might see how it is that the one from Parmenides' philosophy relied upon the concrete reality of the many in Parmenides' real life. We might investigate the concrete reality of the ancient Greek hero cult and see how it is that the social relations that constituted ancient Greece helped to shape its philosophers and philosophies even as these philosophers and philosophies shaped ancient Greece.
He's going to complete the system. Kant, he could not complete the system of German idealism. He's going to derive the complete system.
That was terrifying you, right? That terrifies you, right?
It terrifies me. How can we complete the system of German idealism?
I hope we never do it.
I don't know. No one could do it. Hegel couldn't do it. Schelling couldn't do it. Fichte couldn't do it. Reinhold couldn't do it. Maman couldn't do it. No one could complete the system of German idealism. Trump is a Kantian. I want it to be clear to everyone here. Donald Trump is a Kantian.
Did this video make sense to you? Can you help us complete the system of German idealism? If so, email me at doug.lane@jhpbooks.com. Thanks for watching this Zero Books video. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to this channel and click on the notifications bell so that you'll be alerted whenever we release a new video. You should also consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons get access to our Inside Zero Books podcast every week and can get access to the Zero Books Book Club and help us to continue making online content from the left.